Hi, everyone. So this is our third session of Translate, focused on interactions with regulatory agencies. And the lecture is going to be given by Mwango Kashoki, who is the VP of Regulatory Affairs, Global Head of Regulatory Strategy at Parexel, which is one of the world's largest clinical research organizations. Prior to joining Parexel, Mwango was the Associate Director for Safety in the Office of New Drugs, in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CIDR, at the FDA, and was responsible for ensuring the OND's implementation of policies and processes related to CIDR's various safety initiatives, including the Safety First and Sentinel initiatives. She received her MD from Johns Hopkins University and her MPH from Columbia, and has developed a lot of expertise in this area, and we're excited to hear what she has to share with us. So with that, I will pass it off to you and allow you to get started.
Thank you. And I'm just going to do a double check, make sure you can see my slides. Yes, great. And it's a pleasure to be speaking with you all. Just wonderful to have this opportunity. It's exciting to see what interest people have in pharmaceutical and other types of medical product development, and getting engaged in scientific research and thinking really, how do you consider drug development over the long term? So really glad and really grateful to have this opportunity to share what I know. So in addition to my last role at FDA, I was a medical officer there for almost 16 years. So started in the review divisions and worked my way through different roles and responsibilities. So I bring the perspective from CDER, specifically at FDA, and the Office of New Drugs, to give you the flavor of what interactions can be with the regulatory agency. In terms of how we'll go through this, I'll go through the slides, and then Julia's going to be taking note of any questions that may come up. She may interrupt me as I go along if there's a question that's pertinent to a particular slide, but hopefully we'll have enough time to get through all of the material, and also have time at the end for some dialogue. It's been a long day. I've been talking all day, it feels like. Okay, let's see if this is going to advance. All right, I have to put a disclaimer here that these are the information I share is my own, not necessarily that of Parexel. And today we'll cover, just to get things started, an orientation to FDA and CDER organization, because it's important when considering who we are talking about when we are discussing matters of interactions with the agency. And then I'll spend some time going through the different mechanisms by which a company and individuals, organizations can communicate with FDA. So some government 101, just to let you be oriented to where FDA sits within the government. It's part of the executive branch and is within the Department of Health and Human Services. So together with other health-related agencies such as the CDC or the Center for Medicare Services and others, the FDA is one of the agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services. FDA is a pretty sizable organization. Last I checked, it was over 18,000 employees, and it's divided into primarily centers and offices. The centers are divided according to the main types of products that FDA regulates. So as an example, there's the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, which by its name is focused on drugs. And similarly, there's the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, which focuses on cell, blood, and other types of products that would be classified as a biologics, including vaccines. Center for Veterinary Medicine, you get the idea. And then also within the FDA level, there are other major offices such as Office of Policy or Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. So let's focus in on CDER, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. That center regulates prescription drugs and over-the-counter drugs. And the prescription drugs include certain biologics and generic drugs. And so the center oversees the safety, the efficacy of these drugs while they're in development and also post-approval. Within CEDAR, again, multiple offices, and they are arranged by areas of focus and product types. So as an example, there's the Office of New Drugs, which focuses on non-generic medications and including over-the-counter products. And there will be other offices that are engaged in the assessment of drug products. So surveillance and epidemiology focuses on pharmacovigilance and post-marketing requirements such as risk evaluation and mitigation strategies. There's Office of Clinical Pharmacology, which is self-evident by its name, and so on and so forth. So you can see in the blue colored boxes the different offices within CEDAR, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, that are engaged in assessment of drug products. Now, I mentioned that Office of New Drugs is focused on the oversight regulation of prescription drugs and over-the-counter products. And within Office of New Drugs, it just becomes a maze, as you can see, other offices, and within those offices are various divisions. So the Office of New Drugs has the delegated responsibility to review applications, investigational new drug applications, which I'll describe in a bit, as well as marketing applications. Those are your new drug applications, biologics license applications, and then makes a determination about whether the drug, whether there's enough data to show the safety and efficacy of the drug for the intended use, that is the intended indication. The Office of New Drugs also sets guidances and policies around how to assess products, and how the office, as delegated by CEDAR, would do review of these applications for investigational products. Now, I mentioned that within each OND or Office of New Drugs office are divisions. The Office of New Drugs has divisions that are divided according to specific therapeutic areas. So I've given an example here of the Office of Cardiology, Hematology, Endocrinology, and Nephrology, and included within that office are various divisions, such as the Division of Cardiology and Nephrology. This is really, it sounds like alphabet soup at this point, but it's really important for drug sponsors because it's critical for them to know which center, which office, which division has oversight responsibility for the type of product that they want to develop. And therefore, which ultimately division the sponsor would be talking with over the course of drug development, having those interactions and communications. So within CEDAR, and this is true across all of the centers within FDA, but CEDAR works through multidisciplinary teams. And the scientific staff within CEDAR includes a variety of health professionals, biostatisticians, scientists such as researchers who do non-clinical pharmacology, toxicology, microbiologists, and so on and so forth. We also have lawyers and people who are trained in health communications and so on, because of the public health and cross-disciplinary nature of the work of drug review and drug regulation. The teams, some come together based on a particular issue or a drug application, and generally remain constant over the course of the product's life cycle. Certainly if a product is taking a while to get through the investigational through marketing application phase, there could be some turnover in the team, but the team is fairly constant over time because there's not that much turnover of FDA staff once employed. So the question is always, who is FDA communicating with? It's not solely, the public, and it's not just drug companies. There can be individual researchers or individual investigators who are doing research under an IND. I'll discuss that in a bit. There's a lot of communication with other government agencies, other health agencies internationally, such as the European Medicines Agency, patient organizations, Congress, the media, you name it, FDA has to be and is required to be as a public agency in communication with all interested stakeholders. So the bulk of what I talk about will be on sponsor communication with the FDA. And by sponsor, meaning individuals or organizations that have an application for an investigational product that has been filed with the agency. So when we're talking about, FDA said, and, I spoke with FDA, again, it's important to be clear who is FDA really. So communications that are broad and broadly applicable to a wide audience come out at the level of the FDA commissioner or the center, the applicable center. And this might be in the form of, as an example, a public health alert, a drug safety communication, or just an events announcement or something like that. Communications that pertain to an individual drug product and its development program are made directly to the individual sponsor for that investigational application or marketing application. That communication is confidential based on the rules of confidentiality and disclosure that FDA must operate under. So this is why, unless a company announces that it has submitted an IND or a marketing application or has had some kind of meeting with FDA, this is why you don't hear a lot about specifics of communications between the agency and a drug company. It's only in these limited circumstances. And when this individual sponsor is talking with the FDA, it's in the context of talking with the assembled multidisciplinary review team under the organization of the division that has oversight responsibility for that type of product. So it's very important, it's very useful for sponsors to be in regular communication with FDA over the life span of their drug, and particularly during the investigational phase. Now, there is what is called, what I've been referring to as an investigational new drug application or an IND. This is the authorization from the agency that a company can conduct clinical trials in humans of a product that is not yet marketed for the use that's being studied. There are marketing applications, as I've been referring to. These are of different types. A BLA or biologics license application applies to biologics. New drug application applies to small molecules, and an abbreviated new drug application applies to generics. So when there's a marketing application, that's the entity under which the FDA will discuss a company's product and their development plan. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about an IND. If this is something that is already familiar to you, let me know. But if you have questions, I will answer accordingly. So a common question that FDA would receive is, do I need an IND for X study? The simplest answer is, if you're developing a product for, and I'll focus on drugs, but if you're developing a drug and the intention is to market that drug, right, and you want to study the drug in humans, then yes, you would need an IND, because that is the authority from the agency that you can conduct such clinical investigation. So an IND is, per FDA regulation, an IND is required when you have research that involves a drug. This is something that's intended to, a drug being defined as something that's intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, or otherwise treat or prevent a condition, right? So if your research involves a drug, if you're going to do an investigation, a clinical investigation, i.e. administer the drug or dispense the drug to humans, then you would need to have an IND in place. There are exemption criteria. So if you are doing a study of an already marketed drug, let's take a statin in patients with high cholesterol, and you're using it and you want to test the drug at the approved doses in the approved population for the approved duration of time, you don't need an IND because you're using the drug as per labeled. So, but when it's a new product that has never been approved before, the default is going to be an IND. There are also two types or categories, I should say, of IND. There's what is called commercial IND, and then there's the research or investigator IND. Commercial INDs apply to drug sponsors because, again, they want to commercialize their product. Research INDs are for those persons in academia, or maybe the NIH, one of the NIH institutions wants to, and an investigator there wants to run a trial, and they are either doing a new, studying an approved drug in a new way or a novel drug. Then they too, as academic or individual investigators, would need an IND as well. Okay, so I think I said the information's on the information on the left side, but I wanted to highlight the information on the right side in green. So what's in an IND? What is this IND application? It's essentially the file on the drug product. It has to describe what is the product that's being tested, why is it being tested, what's the rationale for the investigational plan, what does the investigational plan comprise in terms of the manufacturing, quality, et cetera, of the drug product, so that they know what is being given to the participants in the clinical trials, what's the non-clinical data as appropriate that supports it. These are the in vitro studies, the animal studies, the microbiology, et cetera. What are the clinical protocols, the clinical trial protocols? How do you plan to investigate the drug and its effect in humans? Give the full design of those planned trials, and other information such as implications for special populations such as those who are older, pediatric patients, people with renal impairment, et cetera, et cetera. So think of the IND as the entirety, the file, the entirety of information about the drug product at the beginning of the development program, and over time as more data accumulates, as well as more studies are performed. So you're a drug sponsor, you're wanting to initiate your IND, you've been successful in obtaining data that support your initial trial in humans, you submit your application, and you want to, or even before you've submitted your application, you want to know, how do I talk with the agency about what I'm planning to do? So what are the mechanisms that are available to me? There are a variety that exist for sponsor communications. Informal and formal. Informal is through touch points with the assigned project manager. You can consider this person to be the project lead within the agency for the application. There are formal meetings that are predefined under different, under the, I won't go, you can consider it under law and policy, but there are different formal meetings that exist that sponsors can leverage. And these are the main ways in which companies can communicate with the FDA. So in terms of the informal communications through the RPM, the agency prefers that is the point person, right? They need to have a gateway of information in and out through this informal channel. The RPM who is assigned to the product will be made known to the application, rather, will be made known to the sponsor, and their contact information will be provided. Email and telephone are the preferred mechanisms. Email more than calls, because you can document more easily the conversation that occurred. And you can imagine that a regulatory project manager, or the RPM, is assigned to hundreds of applications, and they're not going to pick up the phone for each call, right? So email is the preferred way. And the RPM will be the conduit of these informal inquiries from the drug sponsor to the assigned review team. However, the RPM has training, has experience, et cetera, and he or she is able to answer questions about procedure or other general regulatory requirements particular to that application and drug product and development program, or just more broadly. Oftentimes, drug sponsors want to know, can I just communicate directly with the assigned reviewer? It's a manufacturing question, or it's a clinical trial design question. I just want to talk with the assigned medical officer or the assigned chemist. The agency strongly discourages the reviewers, that's the scientific reviewers, from direct communication with a drug sponsor outside of a formal meeting setting. This is because the volume of inquiries that comes in, it could be potentially quite disruptive. And it also is because it is counter to the process that FDA has to make sure that the responses that it's giving or the information that it's giving to a person who has made an inquiry is indeed correct. There's a lot of vetting of responses, of information, clearance that needs to go from one desk to the other, so to speak, because of the authority and that the agency has, and the need for the information to be correct and approved. So while an informal dialogue just to help shape things along would be desirable, it is generally not permissible. If someone happens to find that the assigned team member to their application, they will be routed back to the RPM for that more informal communication channel. What about these formal meetings, right, that I talked about? There are various types, and then they occur during drug development. So even before you've submitted an IND, in the case of if you have a drug product, an investigational drug product, you can have a formal meeting with the FDA in the form of one or two of these types of meetings, interact and pre-IND, and I'll define them in a bit. Also, along the clinical development path or phase, as you're moving from phase 1 to phase 3, you can have what are known as milestone meetings that where you can touch base with the FDA and talk about the progress to date on the development program. So end of phase 1, that's what EOP stands for, end of phase 1, end of phase 2, and pre-submission of the marketing application. You can have a particular type, it's called a type B meeting. And then if you're not having a milestone meeting and it's not before you've submitted your IND, there are other types of meetings that can happen along the way as needed. These are categorized as type C or D. There are meetings that occur during the review of the application. So once the marketing application has been submitted, you can have touch points with the FDA during their review. These are not regular, they're not frequent, because again, the agency is focused on doing an independent and an unbiased assessment of the data that have been included in the marketing application, but they do allow for time points for communication. Sometimes there's an advisory committee meeting that's held during the NDA or BLA review. And that's another time point where the sponsor and the FDA can have communications about what are the issues to be presented before the advisory committee in this, and the advisory committee meetings are public. And so there'll be some coordination of how that meeting will be run. And then after an NDA or BLA is approved, there can be follow-up meetings depending on how issues arise. But that's getting into some complexity that probably be beyond the call today. So there is guidance that is available for companies to know what the kinds of meetings are, when to have them, how to submit a meeting request. There's guidance on what are the best practices for how to communicate with the FDA. Really critical that sponsors read these guidances and other materials about how and when to communicate with the agency about their particular drug product and their investigational marketing application. If a meeting is requested, if a formal meeting is requested by a sponsor, the FDA will review that request, and then they will determine what's the appropriate type of meeting to have based on the questions that the company wants to discuss with the agency. And depending on the type of meeting, there are different procedures that follow thereafter. So it may seem a bit bureaucratic, but the FDA is a behemoth and it needs structure in order to be able to have good oversight and control and quality control over the interactions that it's having with the multiple drug sponsors. So I mentioned that there are different types of meetings that CDER has. These are also types that are applicable to the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. The types of meetings are labeled by alphabet letter, and then there's also one that is the INTERACT meeting, which stands for the Initial Targeted Engagement for Regulatory Advice on CBER and CDER products. So long name abbreviated to INTERACT. INTERACT happens even before an investigational new drug marketing application is submitted. This is when people are conceptualizing their program, wanting to just understand, in general, am I on the right track? I've just a narrow set of questions that I need to ask the agency because I'm planning to submit an investigational new drug application. A type B meeting could include a pre-IND meeting, which again can happen before a submission of an IND. And that has opportunity to ask more expansive questions, to introduce in more detail the planned initial clinical trial under the IND, details about the drug product, et cetera, et cetera. And then I mentioned that the other types of milestone meetings and the phase 1, so on and so forth. Type A meetings are those urgent meetings when the company urgently needs to have a discussion with the FDA because there's something impeding forward development of their program. So as an example, if FDA has determined that a clinical trial that's proposed under the IND is not safe to proceed based on the FDA's assessment of the submitted protocol and other information, the FDA will put the IND on hold, meaning no further investigations can happen under that IND. That means the development program has come to a halt. Companies, either if they're not able to quickly address the hold issues, will certainly ask for a type A meeting to say, hey, what do I need to do? Will this data suffice, et cetera, so that they can resume clinical investigations. Type C and type D information meetings you can think of as being those that are more for general questions that are arising over the course of development. They're not related to a milestone such as completion of your phase 2 trials. They're not a type 8 issue for discussion, and they're happening after the IND is submitted, so they don't qualify as an interact or a pre-IND meeting. Now, I mentioned, the FDA has got a lot to navigate through when it comes to communications with the public. This is showing, just so you can see volume, meetings that have been requested related to prescription drugs only, right? And prescription non-generic drugs. So this is just to CDER, right? This is like excluding the device inquiries, the ones for biologics, et cetera. And so you can see that the volume is high. In 2021, they had 4,500 meeting requests, and they granted about half of those, or slightly less than half, because of various issues with the meeting request. The FDA can deny on a variety of reasons, but there's a big machinery that goes along with the meeting request, timeframes, documents, and so on and so forth. So the agency is trying to make sure that companies, before asking their question, are really making sure that there's something very important to discuss with the FDA that they otherwise could not find the information for. A common question is, how many meetings can a company have, right? Are they limited? Can I only get 8 meetings over the course of my development program? there isn't a specific number, right? You need meetings as the drug progresses through development and issues come up. But again, FDA can determine whether it's going to grant a meeting. And then also, the FDA limits the numbers of those milestone meetings, end of phase 1, end of phase 2. You can't have 3, as an example, end of phase 2 meetings. That's just counterproductive to everyone involved. So when a company says, I've reached the end of phase of X, right, it's really important that they have made that determination as fully as they can and to seek the FDA's confirmation that it's okay to go on to the next phase of development. So in all of that, when thinking about having a formal meeting with FDA, it's really, really important to think, what are the questions that need to be asked? Is it critical that I obtain agency input before I move forward with the next part of my program? It's for this reason that the FDA puts out a ton of guidances to companies to help them understand regulatory requirements and FDA expectations with regard to how they are to develop their products for the target indication. The guidances cover everything from manufacturing, non-clinical, the statistical analyses, pharmacovigilance, everything that you can think of. So companies are urged to look first at the FDA guidance. This makes better use of the company's resources and the agency's resources. And groups such as myself, the consultants, are also a really great resource before going to or to prepare for a meeting with the FDA. So in terms of best practices for preparing for a meeting, it's important that people understand the development program and goals. This is very important, especially at the pre-IND stage. You know, why do you have that product? What's the intended use? How do you envision that the product will be used in the marketplace? How do you plan to assess benefit? What are the associated risks? How will you evaluate first in non-clinical and so on for the potential risks? How are you justifying dose and route of administration? All of that needs to be clear, very upfront, and especially for your interact and your pre-IND meetings that happen before the IND submission, because what companies don't want is to submit their investigational new drug application or their IND application for their very first clinical trial. And FDA looks at the material and says, you have not provided enough information to say that participants would be safe. There's some significant uncertainty about what you're planning to do. Therefore, we're putting your IND on hold. Nobody wants that outcome. So preparing for the FDA meeting, you want to be clear on what your program is going to look like, be clear on what questions are going to be asked, what's really important to get out of the discussion, a yes/no decision, some guidance about how to proceed, what's important to know now versus later. And it's important that the questions are written clearly and have enough and sufficient justification or explanation for why you're asking that question, why you're seeking, for, as an example, agreement from the agency. The types of meetings, as has previously been discussed, reflect how the issues can gain in complexity and should be discussed at particular time points over the course of the development program. So there's some questions you can save till later. So in phase 1, you could touch on potential phase 2 and 3 clinical trials that would be appropriate to support drug approval, but maybe that's a better question for end of phase 1 or going into phase 2, right? And so the agency would, at that type, if asked that question prematurely, could say, it's too early for us to answer that question. And so you've kind of lost an opportunity to have a more expansive dialogue with the agency on a more pressing issue. So sometimes people think, you know, it's important I get this yes from the agency, right? Sometimes they're not going to agree. Sometimes they're going to say, this is something we'll need to think about when we see your data, because you're only summarizing information when you're preparing for a meeting with the agency. So, you know, companies need to think about, what do I need a clear yes from? So an example is, do I have enough non-clinical information for my study, right, to proceed. That's a clear yes, no answer that could be provided. Or if there's some ambiguity around how to assess benefit or efficacy of a drug, and you're putting forth a novel endpoint, you can say, the question can be, is this acceptable? Does the approach appear reasonable? And then that's where you're seeking the agency's general concurrence with the way you're going at things, and having them express early, if they have any reserves about what's being proposed.
I will just jump in, Mwango, right now, around a question around that exact point that you just brought up, where someone was saying, if you want to use a surrogate marker as the endpoint that's not already approved, do you need to get approval prior to filing the IND, which is probably good practice, or can you use the IND pre-submission for full approval?
Okay, so the discussion about what's an appropriate surrogate endpoint to demonstrate efficacy, right, is a conversation that happens, yes, initially, if you're thinking, I'm going to look at efficacy in a novel way, and that's important to put on the table up front very early in development, so that you can then have discussion about what is the surrogate indeed a valid one? Is it reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit? And by clinical benefit, I mean whether the patient's going to survive, how they function, how they feel, right? So the FDA really wants to have outcomes that are reflect clinical outcomes, not so much surrogate outcomes, so a biomarker or something like that, unless there's strong literature, there's established practice, et cetera, that surrogate is reasonably likely to predict benefit. They're going to ask for clinical outcomes for your efficacy assessment. So have that conversation early. And then the nature of your surrogate will be refined over time as you gather more information with your development program. I've seen that. I'm working with several companies right now who are trying to get approval based on a surrogate, and to understand not only what that biomarker is, but how that effect would be measured has been a multi-year conversation, essentially. But a good question.
Thank you.
Okay, so the reason, right, you're seeking concurrence or general acceptability is because, especially for these novel endpoints, for these new directions or new type of product, et cetera, the agency's got to think about how this not only aligns with the scientific data, the rationale, the plausibility, et cetera, from a scientific clinical perspective, but also from the regulatory precedent perspective, because if the agency breaks new ground or moves away from prior precedent, that opens the door, right, to a new set of inquiries, et cetera. And there's also an important part that, an important concept that the FDA keeps in mind, which is parity across companies, right? So if they've been telling X group of companies, you must do development this way, and somebody comes along with a different proposal, they've got to consider what the impact of that different proposal is on the other companies as well. If it makes sense, if what the new proposal is makes sense, they could shape the future development of these other companies. So they're juggling a lot of considerations as they are considering the questions that have been asked and how to respond. So I just said all of that. That's summarized on this slide. But the good thing is, right, FDA is comprised, the reviewers are scientists, right? They're clinicians, and they are data driven and scientifically based. They love evidence-based in medicine, science, et cetera. So in that regard, they're very open, right? Unless, some things just don't make sense when people present them. But if there's an innovation, whether that's in product technology or statistical assessment or clinical outcome, they will listen, right? Because they're respecting the fact that people who are working in this space have been doing a lot of research in the area and are trying to drive clinical medicine forward in a lot of ways. So as long as the innovator can clearly explain the rationale, show the broader context, show the relationship to existing FDA policy and guidelines and so on, then you're more likely to have a receptive ear from the agency. Okay. I've been talking about meetings during development. I want to just end by talking about meetings that happen during the NDA BLA review. This is a colorful, busy graphic, but it's taken from the FDA's summary of how the CDER, I should say, has a process for doing review of a marketing application. On the we'll call it the x-axis, or at the bottom of the graph, you can see a time period. This is the length of time that the application would be under review by the agency. They're showing different phases that the review takes. And then these two rectangles here, or columns, reflect points in time when there are meetings that could happen with the company about the marketing application. There's the late cycle meeting. There's also mid-cycle meeting. That's the midpoint of the review period, where the FDA will just assess what their conclusions are about the data reviewed to that point. There's no conversation with the agent, with the sponsor itself, but a communication goes out to say, we've done a midpoint review, we may have some concerns. The late cycle meeting is when there's some preliminary high-level conversation about findings. Again, they don't want to bias their assessments and so on, but it's a touch point. And then if there's an advisory committee meeting, that also happens towards the end of the review period. And then always after the FDA has completed its review and taken an action, i.e. made a decision about whether or not to approve the application and therefore approve the drug for marketing, there will be a meeting to discuss the action taken and the assessment made. Usually, if it's an approval decision, that's a very brief meeting. Everyone is happy on the company side, but if it's a non-approval decision, you can imagine that these conversations can be quite complex. So earlier, I mentioned that we can have academic researchers or individual investigators who have an IND in place. And so oftentimes people ask, well, how do these persons communicate with the agency? How are we doing on time? I can't see time with this view. Do I have a lot of minutes, or do I need to, can I keep going?
Yeah, we could probably go for another around 10 minutes and then maybe stop there for questions.
Great. Okay, thank you. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. It simply summarizes when an individual investigator can submit an IND and procedures thereof, and there's guidance for them. So the main point to be, even researchers who have INDs are subject to policies and requirements for INDs, and must maintain safety, et cetera, so that they make sure that the participant safety is assured. So can an individual investigator, or FDA refers to these as investigator sponsors, can they have a formal meeting with the FDA? And the answer is no. The reason is because they're not doing, they're not studying the drug for the purposes of ultimately marketing the drug, right? So the formal meetings that have been established are to help drug companies, drug sponsors who are intending to market the drug at some future point. But investigator sponsors can contact the FDA. They've got the informal mechanism via the regulatory project manager who is assigned to their IND. And they can also utilize the other mechanisms that are available to the public. They can send, for example, an inquiry to the general division of drug information mailbox or something like that. Generally, the academic researchers only contact FDA to have a conversation at the very beginning when they have submitted their investigational new drug or IND application. And other than that, it's just formal submissions to give updates on their application and so on. However, FDA can reach out to the academic researchers. And when that happens, that's generally not a good thing, because it means there's something wrong with your IND, right? Either the protocol is inadequate or something like that. So investigator sponsors get pretty nervous when they understand that the FDA has reached out to them. So FDA holds a ton of meetings, sends out a ton of communications. I've just shown here that they put out a public calendar that reflects all of the public meetings that they're going to have, so you know what the FDA officials are discussing and with whom. This is information that is allowed to be disclosed. Meetings with companies, the drug companies on their individual products are not disclosed, okay? So those formal meetings I was talking about are not disclosed to the public. The only exception being an advisory committee meeting, right?
Just gonna jump in here with another question about academic investigators and if they can have interact or pre-IND meetings.
Generally, no, because again, those are intended for pharmaceutical companies, right, or other drug companies. The investigator can reach out to the division through the Division of Drug Information and just say outline. If I were, usually the inquiries that come in before an IND is submitted are around, is my clinical trial exempt from IND requirements? But it's not, these are academic investigators are not likely to ask the FDA, can you give me advice on my trial design or my endpoints or anything? The FDA would say, it's your study, right? Discuss it with your ethics and then IRB and all those other people. We're just going to make sure that it's safe to proceed.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay. All right, so public meetings and other interactions are available, information is available online. You can look that up. But one thing I wanted to highlight is a set of meetings that have come up more recently under a congressional mandate through different acts and that have been passed by Congress. And this is actually a good thing. The agency had been trying to push for this and find mechanisms for how to interact more with patients. People have talked about patient-focused drug development. Certainly, for many, many years, the desire to improve communication between healthcare providers and patients has been important as well. Seeing patients as partners in their healthcare. So at the drug development, in the drug development space, this concept has been carried forward. So the agency, in addition to putting out guidance on how to consider patient input into drug development, has also been hosting what they call patient-focused drug development meetings with patient advocacy groups, patient organizations, et cetera, to talk about issues of concern that patients have. And patients can meet with the agency, have an organized meeting to discuss everything from burden of participation in clinical trials, treatment outcomes that are important to them, anything that is of mind and what would be of interest to the agency, because it's important for the agency to understand what is useful to shape how the agency considers safety and effectiveness of an investigational drug. These a lot of the times these patient-focused drug development meetings have been for rare diseases or drugs that have an unmet medical need, such as sickle cell, anemia, but it can also be for patients for more common diseases, such as asthma, if patients want to talk about another way to measure improvement in their asthma symptoms. So been very well received and very helpful overall. Now, what if you just have a general question that you want to ask the FDA? The FDA has different mailboxes where you can submit a question. Essentially, they have each center has a division of drug CEDAR has a division of drug information, but other centers will have a division of information that can triage the question to appropriate groups within the agency or themselves answer the question. So the public can submit questions to the agency as well. The responses will be broad. They will not be product specific or sponsor specific due to disclosure and confidentiality rules, but hopefully will be informative enough for people to understand where else they can go on the FDA website for information or just have on hand a direct answer to their question. So I think, oh yeah, I made it to the end. I will can keep my screen on and see if there are any other questions that have come in.
All right, Mwango, thank you so much. We do have one follow-up question to the question that was asked previously about investigator INDs, and whether or not these could be sort of in collaboration with the FDA. If those studies are being done with the hope of spinning off into a company, and so it's being done in an academic setting at first, but ultimately will be moved into commercial setting, is that a situation where the FDA might be willing to interact with the academics doing this?
Yeah, so as soon as the investigation is for, future commercial development and marketing of a product, then the IND has to be changed from an investigator sponsor or research IND to a commercial IND, right? And this is important for a variety of reasons. We want to trigger to everyone that this is now a product that is being developed commercially. The sponsor now has to be clearly identified, and the expectations at this point from the FDA regarding accessibility, quality, oversight, et cetera, of the trial become much more significant. So as an example, academic institutions that are maybe testing an investigational product that's not yet approved, they have right of reference, right, to the supporting data for that product, right? But now as a sponsor, you should own those data, right? So it becomes a big shift. And so academic researchers who are working in partnership with other institutions, you can see, partnerships with BARDA, sometimes partnerships with NIDA, or some other NIH institute. It's important to figure out what is your plan ultimately if you're going to move that product forward from academic research into a commercial product.
That makes sense. Thanks. I guess one question that I had personally, and it's kind of a high level question, but I know many of the people attending have interests across the sort of drug modality spectrum. So some in cell therapy, some in gene therapy, small molecule drugs, et cetera. Where do each of those modalities sort of fit in the CBER versus CDER paradigm? Because it seems like, based on what you described, a lot would fall in CDER except for like cell therapy. But yeah, I'm a little confused on that. I just wanted you.
Yeah, so within CBER, you can think of that as having the blood and tissue derived products, right? So your cell therapies, your gene therapies, your plasma based products, your blood for transfusion, vaccines, right? So your monoclonal antibodies, your peptides, et cetera, those would be considered drugs under CDER's purview, and then those other products that I just described would be biologic products under CBER's purview. I can send a link after this that shows how that split of products between CBER and CDER have been made. Sometimes you have combination products, right? So you could have, well, this happened. So combination products where there's a device component to a drug, and so the product would be reviewed by both CDRH, which is the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, as well as, let's call it CDER, right, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and then the two centers work together to find a single responsible center. But again, FDA works in multidisciplinary teams. They bring the teams in from across the two centers to assess the product.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Thank you. And then we just had one follow-up question going back to our previous one. I think a lot of participants are, part of the Nucleate program, the activator, and are in this kind of between academic and industry space as they kind of spin out companies. Yeah. And so they were wondering if there's any specific guidance documents about that handoff from academics study to commercial sponsor.
There isn't a standalone guidance necessarily. If they already have products in development, they're probably following the guidance that's available for individual investigators and IND requirements. If you don't have access to that guidance, I can send that link to you. However, there are instructions on how to administratively make the switch from a research IND to a commercial IND. This is why it becomes very important to understand the IND requirements, because the FDA will make some latitude for the academic researcher, right? but once because they know that the access to information, the ability to ensure, quality safeguards, you're probably not conducting the trial according to ICH good clinical practice standards, all that sort of thing. So once that switch to commercial is made, those expectations come in place immediately. So you need to be prepared for that. But I'm not aware of any guidance that says, here's how you transition. You have to just have someone like myself and others who have that expertise to make sure that you are thinking about the right things, having the right systems, et cetera, in place to be able to meet all of the requirements, especially around reporting, et cetera, that are expected for a commercial IND.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. I thought that we could end with a question kind of about your career path. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about how you found yourself from medicine to the FDA and then to Parexel, and kind of your thought process and how you made those decisions along the way.
Yeah, I shared that a little bit when you reached out with this invitation to speak. So bear with me. I'm going to repeat what you heard before, the two of you. But yeah, I began my journey in science thinking I'd do bench research, right? My major was molecular biology, and I was like, I love the lab. And then I realized I love clinical medicine, so I decided to apply to medical school and was all set to do internal medicine. I even got into an internal medicine program and did that. But always in my mind, I had a public health leaning, right? So I was like, I was going to do bench research so that I could work in the area of HIV/AIDS, and I was going to do internal medicine so that I could work in a public health space. But as I was over the course of my training, I had opportunity to do different kinds of research, a lot of public health research, and that fueled my fire even more to with an interest in public health. So it was in my second year of residency for internal medicine. I always tell this story. I don't mind repeating it, but I was in the ICU. I had a patient crash, a patient die, and I was like, this is not for me. I am not an internist. I am not a hospitalist. And so I had to really have a serious talk with myself about what do I envision myself doing. So I switched from internal medicine to preventive medicine and public health, and that was the right fit for me, right? Because it put me in touch with public health and organizations and policy and data analysis and so on, and I was really pleased by that. People were like, "What is wrong with you? You could finish internal medicine, and don't you want to be in the hospital? What kind of career is preventive medicine?" And so you have to really follow your passion. And I think that it sounds trite, but it's true. Go with what feels true to you in terms of your career experience. So once I went into preventive medicine, I had a great opportunity to do the kinds of research that it excited me, such as even working at the Surgeon General's office and working on the Surgeon General's report on overweight and obesity. And so I was like, I'm in my zone, I have data, I have a public health focus. So once I was finishing that program, I was trying to think, where would I go, right? And I immediately was thinking of agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services. It was going to be NIH, CDC, FDA. And I was sending out applications and trying to make inquiries. And it turns out that one of the people who eventually ended up hiring me went to the same school as me. That also helps when they see your school on the application. I was like, this person probably brings a little something to the table. So she talked with me about the work at FDA, and I was like, this sounds fascinating. I get to work with data all the time. I get to do policy. I get to do public health. I get to see clinical trials. And that's why I stayed at the agency for so long. I really enjoyed that public health mission, it's for a preventive medicine person, and it's tertiary prevention. Diseases happen, now you're just treating, but it was still true to what I wanted to do. Being at the agency for a long time, I got to see one aspect of drug development. I did not have enough of a view as to what are the challenges, what are the issues that companies consider, right? And so that's why I said, let me leave the agency and get more of that drug developer experience. I didn't want to be a single pharmaceutical company because I would be limited in scope in terms of the types of products I would see. So a consulting group in a very large CRO such as Parexel gave me that same experience as FDA, where they see a wide variety of programs and advise companies. And so I'm doing the same thing. I'm looking at data, I'm advising companies, but from a different perspective, trying to now influence the regulator in terms of being able to see what the companies are trying to do and why they're doing it in this way. And don't be so rigid, government agency, think beyond the box. So it's been a great journey, and it had a lot of successes, some highs and some lows, but it was the right decision for me, and I'm very happy.
It's incredible to hear about your journey, and I think we'll close it out there. Thank you so much for coming and sharing this information and kind of your experiences. This is an incredibly important topic, regulatory science, but it can sometimes be dense and difficult to jump into. And so having someone like you break it down and really explain these basics from, how is the agency structured to when those meetings are happening, what to bring and what to expect is so helpful to all of our teams and the folks who have participated today. So just want to send a heartfelt thank you your way.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Yeah. And I'll hand it back to Sayo to finish up about next sessions.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Mwango, for your lecture. I think I personally learned a lot from this, and I think everyone who attended definitely took a lot away as well. Just pulling up my screen here to tell you a little bit about our next session, which will be sort of in the same vein as this one, but except specifically focused on designing and conducting clinical trials. That lecture will be delivered by Dr. Allison August, who's the Chief Medical Officer at Comanche Biopharma. She also spent some time at Moderna over the past couple of years, and while there was the VP of Clinical Development and Infectious Disease, which clearly is a very important role over the past couple of years because she played a pivotal role in the COVID-19 trials that Moderna ran. So if you're interested in clinical development and the lecture that we received today sort of sparked your interest, please join us for session 4. You could RSVP at the link below, and we'll send that out to everyone who is in attendance today. So thank you again, Mwango, for joining us, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.